The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Side Chapter 1. In a Divine Realm. In the space between worlds, Rodkart, the god who ruled over the circles of transmigration for multiple worlds, including Earth, Origin, and Lambda, had created a place that could be called a divine realm, and was currently sitting in there. This was also the place that the souls of the 100 people who had died on Earth had once gathered. Rodkart was currently observing Origin's present state. As a god, he was capable of seeing many things happening there from outside the world. He was far from omniscient, but he could gain a general picture of things. The lapsing of Origin into chaos is inevitable. I suppose the cause lies in the existence of Amamiya Hiroto and his death, he said, speaking to himself. The world where magic and science coexisted, where Vandaloo had lived during his second lifetime, where Amamiya Hiroto and the others who were reincarnated there were still living. Rodkart considered this world to be as far developed as Earth, but it was falling deep into chaos. The cause of this was Vandaloo, Amamiya Hiroto's death attribute. The military nation that had used him as an experimental animal extorted death attribute mana out of him and produced a large number of magic items that exceeded common sense. Cookware capable of fermenting food to make it reach the optimum level of maturity in an instant. Storage cabinets that kept food preserved almost permanently. Medical equipment that removed any poison and illness from the body without causing any harmful effects. Pills that restored the organs with impaired functions due to aging, illness, or injury. Hair regrowth medicine that restored lost hair. Things that had been impossible through other attributes of magic and previous science. Things that had been theoretically possible but almost impossible to actually create in practice. Such things had been created at unbelievably low costs. The death attribute mana had created dreamlike produce and domestic livestock, led to the announcement of cures for previously incurable viruses, pathogens, and hereditary diseases, and even made cryogenic sleep possible. Research had almost reached the secret behind immortality. If one were to ask whether such things were possible with death attribute mana alone, the answer is that it really was. At a glance, the death attribute may seem like a simple counterpart to the life attribute. Indeed, the things both attributes were capable of were similar, and if the life attribute transcends its highest limits, it can achieve exceedingly close results. However, they are not completely the same. The reason is because life is energy. No matter how much energy one adds, no matter how much one tries to limit its consumption, it will run out eventually. In other words, death occurs. The death attribute is one that governs over death. It is able to remove the phenomenon of death from living things. It is free to accelerate or stop decomposition in the same way. It is simple to produce things that can eliminate poison and illnesses. It is not even difficult to return failing organs and cells to a healthy state. However, the military nation that discovered the death attribute had caused Amamiya Hiroto to die in their reckless experiments, and the others who had reincarnated in this world had thoroughly destroyed him. Not even a single fragment of his mana had been left behind. Nobody could create death attribute magic items anymore. The research could not continue. The produce and livestock that had been created still remained, but those alone were not enough to satisfy mankind. The military nation was internationally condemned for the existence of the research laboratory that had conducted illegal experiments and completely ignored human rights. Its president and the high officials that had been involved with the laboratory resigned, but that was only the beginning. The dreamlike magic items that the military nation had been producing and selling were now completely impossible to create. The largest nation in the international committee that had condemned the military nation for its actions immediately began research on the death attribute. Amamiya Hiroto had killed most of the researchers in the original laboratory and consumed much of their spirits. Their souls were just barely intact, but their memories and personalities were not in a state for them to be useful, so even methods such as necromancy were useless. The few survivors, the remaining research materials, and the death attribute magic items possessed by each nation were all gathered for analysis in a desperate attempt to reproduce the death attribute. The people in power had been lured by the industrial and medical advances offered by the death attribute, or rather, the word immortality, which had almost been achieved. The military nation had become much weaker, but as long as the powerful men of the world continued to desire immortality, the secret feuds between the feudal states, commonwealths, republics, and few nations would surface in a large way. Wars could break out and cause the loss of millions, tens of millions of lives. I don't really care about that, but Rodcart had no interest in calculating those numbers. In fact, people being killed in war would be a wonderful thing. He would welcome them with open arms. He was the god who ruled over the circles of transmigration after all. It would be problematic if people did not die and come to be reborn. Even if tens of millions of people were to die all at once, Rodcart's transmigration system wouldn't have any difficulties in dealing with them. It could process up to 1 trillion people at one time. There would be no problem at all. Origin had a population of 10 billion people. Only a small number, not even 1% of them, would die in war, and their numbers would soon increase again afterwards. Things would be back to normal in less than 100 years. In fact, people's life expectancies in Origin had surpassed those on Earth by too much due to the existence of magic in Origin in addition to science, so this was perfect. Rodcart did indeed desire the world's development, but a society capable of sustaining a population of billions of people without falling to ruin could already be considered nothing but a good result. Even if a population of 7 billion were to shrink to 5 billion, he would consider it as only a minor decrease. Rather, if humanity underwent some kind of spiritual evolution or reached some kind of next stage, then they really would be beyond his control. He wouldn't mind if they advanced into outer space, however. With that said, Rodcart had no intentions of directly intervening with the world, and his ability to do so was limited, so he couldn't do anything about the situation anyway. If he wanted to stop the conflict and war in Origin, it was possible for him to send a divine message to those who had been reincarnated from Earth in order to guide them and give them information. However, he had no intention of doing that either. The reason he had sent them to Origin rather than Lambda in the first place was so that they could gain experience. He had helped them by giving them cheat-like abilities, fortunes, and destinies, so he would have them do as they liked, whether they chose to stop the conflict, participate in it, or simply stay uninvolved. If war began, some of them, maybe even dozens of them, could die. That would be an experience for them in itself. There were 100 of them after all. There would be no problem if some of them failed. For Rodcart, a god who was not directly believed in by humans, humans were nothing but bits in a computer, just information flowing in a system. Good and evil, tragedy, happiness, none of that mattered. Everything would be fine as long as the system continued working with no problems. The problem is immortality, I suppose. The thing that would cause Rodcart trouble was immortality. As he was a god ruling over the circles of transmigration, creatures that don't die would be nothing but beings who denied his authority and hindered his system. It would be even more problematic than undead who continued moving after death and the resurrection of the dead. Undead are a result of souls lingering in the world without being reincarnated, but they would still return to the system eventually. The resurrection of the dead was problematic, but if the soul was already transmigrated, only the body would be resurrected, and the soul would never return. Only a small error would be caused. However, immortal beings would never return. If undead were small errors that wouldn't cause any problems even if left alone for a while, and the resurrection of the dead was a bug that was slightly more difficult to fix, immortal beings would be a critical bug that would require the system to be brought down for maintenance in order to eliminate. Even considering that, it's good that Amamiya Hiroto died. If Amamiya Hiroto had continued to live, the research had gone on, and immortality had become a reality, Rodcart would have been racking his brains over how to deal with it. Even if he were to send those reincarnated from Earth a divine message, he possessed no way of forcing them to obey his commands. He couldn't even send divine messages to humans other than them. This was also because Rodcart's existence was not known, and he was not worshipped by the people of any world. This was to ensure that if something serious were to happen in one world, it would not affect the circles of transmigration in other worlds. But he was now regretting not preparing another being like a subordinate god or a collaborative god. Gods are not omniscient or omnipotent. Their direct influence extends only as far as their authority allows, and those who believe in them. No, for now, Origin would be fine. Rodcart would let it be. Mankind would not self-destruct or decrease in numbers too drastically. Coming to this conclusion, Rodcart shifted his gaze away from Origin. And then he suddenly realized something. It has been 5 years since Amamiya Hiroto reincarnated in Lambda. His memories may have returned by now. Memories of previous lives, returning while still in the body of a breastfeeding infant, would have placed a huge mental burden on reincarnated individuals. In order to protect their minds, Rodcart had set things up so that their memories would start returning from the age of 5 onwards. As nothing hugely troublesome and unexpected occurred, memories would not return to a breastfeeding infant. The fact that Amamiya Hiroto's soul has not returned here means that he was unfortunate enough to not die within the first 5 years of his life. It may be some time before his memories return, but I should check to make sure. If Amamiya Hiroto's memories had indeed returned, Rodcart had to drive him to suicide so that he would die before it was discovered that he could potentially make immortality a reality. He had placed 3 curses on him, but even Rodcart had been unable to erase the death attribute that had soaked into his soul and become part of him. If he struggled and refused to give up, he would learn to cast death attribute magic in Lambda as well. For this purpose, Rodcart used his system to investigate Amamiya Hiroto's life following his reincarnation. Through this system, it was possible to look at a reincarnated soul's past and present situation. However, there was no information about Amamiya Hiroto. What is this? He searched again, but there was no information. There were records of his reincarnation from Earth to Origin, but the records suddenly stopped following his death in Origin. Could it be that he wasn't reincarnated? That isn't possible. Amamiya Hiroto was definitely reincarnated, but the fact that there are no records in the system means... Oh no, he fell outside of my system and entered a circle outside of my control. For Rodkart, there were 3 irregularities in Lambda. The first was the undead that even appeared from time to time in Origin. The other 2 were the monsters that the Demon King and his subordinates had created in ancient times, and the new races created by the goddess Vida. Those 2 were not managed by Rodkart's Circle of Transmigration system. When the Demon King created the monsters, if their transmigration fell under the categories of Rodkart's system, the Demon King would have been unable to reincarnate the monsters' souls and have them reborn. For this reason, he had somehow managed to imitate Rodkart's Circle of Transmigration system and create his own transmigration system. That was why monsters were still rampant in Lambda to this day. This was also the reason bosses and mid-bosses were unnaturally generated inside dungeons. Humans and other races who worshipped the evil gods were now falling outside of Rodkart's system and being incorporated into the now fallen Demon King's system instead. This was another thing causing slightly problematic errors in Rodkart's system. And the problems caused by the races created by Vida were due to the hostility between Vida, or rather all of the gods in Lambda, and Rodkart. When the Demon King first appeared, the gods of Lambda, known as Vida and Alda, asked Rodkart for help. Rodkart had refused all of their requests and simply observed carefully. If he were to get involved and the Demon King destroyed his soul, this would have effects on all of the circles of transmigration of the other worlds he managed, not just Lambda. This was a decision he made to prevent that from happening. To Rodkart, Lambda was but one of many worlds. If it were destroyed, Rodkart would feel pain equivalent to several bones being broken, but it wouldn't be a fatal wound. He wasn't willing to risk a swift death in order to avoid his bones being broken. After that, Rodkart had protested against the decision of the gods of Lambda to summon champions from other worlds in order to turn the tides of the battle. Because the champions had only been summoned from worlds whose circles of transmigration Rodkart ruled over, this had caused errors in his system. He had requested that they quickly send the champions back, or simply exploit them until they died. Back then, Rodkart had thought that Lambda's destruction was inevitable, so he hadn't wanted more trouble to be caused by a meaningless struggle. And as a result, a deep gulf formed between Rodkart and the gods of Lambda. Rodkart himself didn't think much of it, but Vida in particular held a profound distrust in him. With this as one of the reasons, Vida made an imitation of the system created by the Demon King, with her own original functions included, creating her own Circle of Transmigration system, and then gave birth to new races, including the vampires. As she ruled over the life attribute, her divinity was quite close to Rodkart's. It would have been impossible for her to rule over the circles of transmigration for multiple worlds, but she probably thought that she would be able to manage one world once she built the system for it. It was likely that she intended for not only the races she created, but for all the future races of people that would exist in Lambda to be managed by her own circle of transmigration system. However, despite being hostile towards Rodcart as Vita was, Alda, who prioritized the strict preservation of law and order above all else, defeated Vita and her followers. As a result, only the new races created by Vita were being reincarnated through Vita's system. There was a high chance that Amamiya Hiroto's soul had been swallowed up by either the Demon King's system or the Goddess's system, and he had become reborn as either a monster or a member of one of the races created by Vita. He isn't here after all. Using his system, Rodcart looked up all of the people who had been born around the time of Amamiya Hiroto's second reincarnation, but no information on Hiroto was to be found. But just why has something like this happened? The probability of this happening is less than 1 in 10 quadrillion, unless I am just terribly unlucky. Oh no. It is because of that. Rodcart remembered that the things Amamiya Hiroto had not been given included not only cheat-like abilities, but a fortune and a destiny as well. As he had no fortune and no destiny, there was always a constant danger that he would go along a path even Rodcart himself wouldn't be able to predict. On top of that, the 3 curses had been placed on him just before he was reincarnated. Rodcart had done this in order to encourage him to end his own life, but the possibility that this had caused flaws in Rodcart's system could not be ruled out. I have no choice. It will take some time, but I will investigate if there are any people who have encountered Amamiya Hiroto's reincarnated soul. I should at least be able to learn of his current situation. This is a Dhampir? There was a Dhampir appearing in the memories of a certain merchant. It seemed that Amamiya Hiroto had indeed been reincarnated as a member of a race created by Vita, but this wasn't the problem. Impossible! Why have his memories returned? On top of that, he is already using death attribute magic and controlling the undead. Rodcart couldn't even tell whether the Dhampir in this memory was even a year old or not, and yet he was already using death attribute magic and speaking with a childish voice. His memories had clearly returned. I suppose this is because I did not give him a fortune. In that case, I have to improve my method the next time I have a chance. Rodcart regretted the mistakes he had made during the process of reincarnating Amamiya Hiroto and the others from Earth. Back then, Rodcart had prepared enough cheat-like abilities, fortunes, and destinies for a little over 100 people. He had prepared plenty so that he wouldn't be lacking even if there were many people to distribute them to. And just as he finished preparing, the ferry had sunk with good timing, and around 100 people, not including the evil people responsible, had died. Among them, all but one chose to be reborn in another world. Thinking that it would be a waste to not use everything he had prepared, he had distributed it all without leaving a single item remaining, only to find that he had overlooked one person. To think that this one remaining person would become so troublesome as a result. Now then, the question is what to do with Amamiya Hiroto. Vandaloo. Should I warn Alda? I suppose it would be better to set the evil gods on him. Alda was the only attribute god who was still currently properly active in Lambda, the god who possessed the most power. However, his relationship with Rodcart was as terrible as it could be. Alda had no choice but to overlook Rodcart's actions so that the order of the circles of transmigration would be preserved, but that did not mean that he forgave them. Rodcart's decision to reincarnate these people had been made without Alda's knowledge. Because of this, if Alda were to find out about Vandaloo and the others, he would be infuriated with Rodcart. From Alda's point of view, Rodcart had abandoned him in a time of need without offering any assistance, and now he was doing these things on his own, and 100 more people would be reincarnating in Lambda with jinxes, cheat-like abilities that defied common sense that Rodcart had given them on a whim. It was more than likely that Alda would order his subordinate gods and followers to murder those 100 reincarnated individuals. With that said, leaking information to the evil gods to have them kill Vandaloo would also be a poor move. The evil gods had their senses of values so twisted that Rodcart could not understand them. It was possible that they would make Vandaloo their ally instead of killing him. As a result of much contemplation, Rodcart decided to watch and wait for a while. A few of those reincarnated in Origin should die in the next few years. I'll ask them to kill Vandaloo. Undead had always appeared in Lambda, so the number of undead increasing by a few wouldn't have any effect on the system now. And for Vandaloo, whose curses would prevent him from turning his experiences into skills, reaching immortality without the assistance of the science of Origin would be an enormous task. It would be impossible to do so in decades, centuries, or possibly even millennia. In a few years' time, once the second of the reincarnated individuals died in Origin, he would ask that person to kill Vandaloo, and then there would be no problem. That person would have cheat-like abilities created by Rodcart himself, while Vandaloo had only death attribute magic and the 100 million mana contained within his empty frame. When Rodcart analyzed the records from the merchant, it seemed that Vandaloo had succeeded in leveling up, but the other two curses should still be functioning with no problems. He would probably not become any stronger than that. There was no problem. Coming to this conclusion, Rodcart turned his gaze away from Lambda. If he had searched the memories of the adventurer Luciliano, who had encountered Vandaloo through his live dead, he might have felt a greater sense of danger. If he had made contact with the evil gods, he would likely have learned that the souls of the vampire Serkrant had been destroyed by Vandaloo and made a move before the souls involved in his own system were destroyed. But instead, Rodcart remained oblivious to the greatest mistake that he had ever made.